Okay, so as I was pointed out to me is that time is money, and we're on 5 minutes late time, so I'm apologizing for that, but we're a panel member short, so we were giving the panel member a chance to join with us. And so with that being said, so I welcome you to Degrees Diner today for the knowledge exchange on Extinction Then and Now. And I hope this does not include this room, right? So let's hope that that's going to be a safe space. So I'm Dr. Hans-Joachim Wieden, and I'm the Associate Vice President, Partnerships, Knowledge Mobilization and Innovation. And as you know from last time, we call it Pick Me, but we're not going to go that way. I'm pleased to be here tonight for the exploration of the impacts that climate change has on large predators like polar bears, and today, and maybe in the past on Tyrannosaurus rex, and my middle child will be proud of me that I actually used the opportunity to say Tyrannosaurus rex. Okay, so this is the piece. Usually you will hear me say something about Star Trek, but that's okay. So today it's the Tyrannosaurus rex, or polar bears, and firstly I would like to acknowledge to recognize that the University of Manitoba is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Inunuak, the Assininuak, the Dakota Oyate, and the Dene Soline, and on the homelands of the nation of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties and were made on these territories, and we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And I'm immensely grateful that as an uninvited guest on these lands, I have the opportunity to raise my kids, and some of them are here today. Let's raise my kids here. The knowledge exchange is an important opportunity for the University of Manitoba researchers to share emerging knowledge with members of the public and the wider community. And as the people, or as you that have been joining us for a while, it's also a very interesting opportunity for the researchers to hear about the community's thoughts about the research that's going on and what are concerns. And we had a long discussion about this last time about AI and the impact this has, for instance, about learning. And today we're going to see aspects of that with respect to climate change. The Knowledge Exchange is hosted by the Office of Vice President Research and International, and with support of Learning for Life Network. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Kirstin Brink. Wave. An associate professor and grad chair in the Department of Earth Sciences at the Clayton Riddell Faculty of Environment, Earth and Resources. And I for sure do, but some of you may remember Dr. Brink from her recognition in 2023 as one of Manitoba's 100 most interesting people by, and I don't know how to say that, 103.3 FM. Is there like a slang way of saying this? I'm streaming. I don't know what radio does. Anybody? Is that okay to say 103.3? Yeah? All right, let's go. FM, right? There we go. All right. And for her contribution to an international study which provided that Tyrannosaurus rex, I can say it again, Tyrannosaurus rex, I can say it again, and other dinosaurs had scaly lizard-like lips that were protecting their teeth from chattering, if I remember this correctly, right? Yeah, see, there you go. And unlike depicting in films where like Jurassic Park, where they had not, right? And so my kid would be super excited to be here, and Eva is going to report on that, right? It's now my pleasure to pass things over, and I'm done with babbling around, to Kirstin, and she will run the show. I'll keep my microphone, and then you go. Okay, thank you. Enjoy.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'll do a quick overview of how this hybrid presentation will work. Each of our panelists will speak briefly on their perspective based on their expertise on tonight's topic on extinction. And then I will open things up for questions. A microphone will be passed around for everybody who is with us in person. And the live stream viewers can submit their questions via email at the address appearing on the screen and in the YouTube description below. So tonight's expert panel, we have Dr. Joe Moysiuk, who's a curator of paleontology and geology at the Manitoba Museum. He specializes in the macroevolution, evolutionary developmental biology, and the origin of animal body plans in the fossil record. So our paleontology rep. And we have Dr. Margaret Docker, who's a professor of biological sciences at the University of Manitoba Faculty of Science and co-chair of the Freshwater Fishes Subcommittee of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, and the lead editor of the Journal of the Great Lakes Research. So, Joe, how about you go first and just give us a brief introduction to your research and your perspectives on extinction?
Sounds good. Thanks very much, Kirstin, for the introduction there. And so like Kirstin was saying, I'm a specialist in very early animal life. So I have a bit of a confession to make. If you're hoping for dinosaurs tonight, I might disappoint you because it's not really my area. So if you're hoping for some grubby little invertebrates that lived long before the age of dinosaurs, then I might be able to satisfy you. Like Kirstin was saying, my research interests have largely focused on the origination of species during this early phase in animal evolution. So it's been called the Cambrian explosion. And during this period about 500 million years ago, so roughly 7 times the age of T-Rex, we see the origin of essentially all of the major animal body plans that we still have with us today on Earth. And I think this is very interesting from a large-scale evolutionary perspective because it's such a unique event in Earth's history. But I guess tonight our topic is on extinctions, which are sort of the other side of the evolutionary coin from originations. And so in the fossil record, we know that there are these certain time periods where originations and extinctions are kind of desynchronized from each other. So one of the interesting patterns that we've learned from the fossil record is actually that origination and extinction often do match up with each other pretty well. They go hand in hand. There's some reasons for that based on the sorts of processes that are leading to speciation and extinction. But there are these periods, like I say, where either origination or extinction is dominating in the fossil record. This is something that is actually not a very old insight. This is something that we've only known about really for a relatively short period of time. So going back into history, if we go back into the 1700s in Europe, for example, the general thought was that organisms were formed on Earth at around the same time, and they all kind of persisted up to the present day. There was no conception of extinction in the broad public mind. And so it's only once more fossil discoveries started to appear of things like mammoths and dinosaurs that clearly aren't still with us today, that it became clear that some organisms had actually gone extinct. And so then if you fast forward a little bit, you get to Darwin's time in the mid-1800s, and of course this concept of evolution is firmly grounded in this idea of extinction as an important phenomenon in the history of life on Earth. But Darwin's view was very gradualistic, so there was a tendency to think that evolution must be happening, bit by bit over time and not necessarily happening discontinuously through time. And so it's really only once you get into the 1980s that the concept of mass extinctions starts to gain in sort of wide understanding. And there's 2 discoveries that were key for that, really. One is that people started to scrutinize the fossil record in a little bit more detail and look at the patterns of the occurrences of species through time. And they noticed these large-scale patterns. And in particular, there are these 5 periods in Earth's history where we see a rapid decline in the diversity of species, probably something in the order of 50 to 75% of species or more over the span of a couple million years or less, which is a blink of an eye in terms of the great geologic age of the Earth. And then there's a rebound over some millions of years after those events. So that's the first insight, is just from those large-scale patterns that we can observe in the fossil record. And then the second insight is where the dinosaurs do come in a little bit. So people recognized these layers of this chemical element iridium in sediments all around the world. And iridium is associated with asteroid impacts. It's associated with space rocks. And so the presence of this layer in rocks that are exactly the right age for the last of the non-bird dinosaurs kind of seems too coincidental to not match up. And so the idea that formed at that time is that an asteroid had impacted with the Earth, and that the fallout from that asteroid had led to environmental changes that killed off the last of the non-bird dinosaurs. And so, like I say, there's these 5 mass extinctions throughout Earth's history that are very noticeable in the fossil record. There's also a series of other more minor extinction events that happened throughout the last 500 million years, when we can reliably look at species diversity, because we have a good fossil record of animals. But I guess for the remainder of my introduction here, I thought that I would talk a little bit about what we've learned about these extinction events since finding out that they existed, and what sorts of insights we can gain from them that might be relevant for some of the changes that we're observing today in the world, and also where these past events might not be relevant, where there might be differences, and what we're seeing today might be a non-analog situation. So looking broadly at these mass extinctions, we might look at the end Cretaceous mass extinction event with this asteroid impact and naively think, okay, there's not much that's actually similar about what was going on at the end of the Cretaceous and what's going on now. But if you think more broadly about the sorts of patterns of changes that were happening at the end of the Cretaceous and other mass extinctions, some general patterns come out. So we see climate change is often associated with many of these mass extinctions. It could be either global warming or global cooling. We generally see a loss in species habitat areas. So that could be due to much slower processes like continental drift that could remove some of the shallow coastal environments that lots of different organisms live in. But it could also be, for example, from the development of ice caps or desertification or things like that. Other things that tend to be associated with mass extinctions would be like ocean current changes, which again can be related to continental positions, but they can also be related to climate, as some of these ocean current changes that we're starting to see today are. Another thing that seems to be shared in common with a lot of these mass extinctions is that there are multiple of these different factors that seem to be interacting at roughly the same time. So we know in the fossil record that there isn't a mass extinction every time the climate changes, and there isn't a mass extinction, every time an asteroid impacts the Earth. So why are they happening at these particular times? I think the general consensus on this is that there are multiple stressors that are interacting at around the same time that form sort of a perfect storm that stresses ecosystems past their breaking point. And so there's this idea of a press and pulse hypothesis with extinctions, where you sometimes have these long-acting processes that change the environment over a much longer time period, the press, and then you have a short-term pulse that puts that final stressor in that pushes the ecosystem across the breaking point. If we think about species on an individual level instead of on a sort of worldwide level, there's also a few factors that have come out from studying the fossil record that have been considered to be indicators of extinction risk. So those might be things that we want to be looking at in modern species as well. So one of those that is very significant often is the geographic range of that species. So the larger the range of a species in the fossil record, the lower the chances of it going extinct. Another factor, latitude. Species that live closer to the poles generally have a greater risk of extinction. Maybe because the environment is more changeable or because food chains are less robust there. There's some other factors as well, like for example, interestingly, the age of a species actually has a correlation with how likely it is to go extinct. So a species that's been around for longer already actually has a better chance of surviving than a more newly originated species. And there's some hypotheses as to why that might be. I guess many of you may have heard this notion that we're potentially entering a 6th mass extinction. So I think this brings some of this insights that we can get from the fossil record into understanding what we see in the modern world. And like I was saying, there are some factors that we see in the fossil record that are probably going to be relevant to what we're seeing now. So, we see commonalities like the climate change, the shifting ocean currents, multiple stressors interacting at one time. But there are also some differences. There are differences even just in terms of the way that we actually measure diversity. So, in order to measure extinction rates and compare extinction rates now with extinction rates in the fossil record, we have to, of course, measure each of those different rates. And because of the different biases that are inherent to those data, that's not a straightforward task. So in the modern, we know that there are around 2 million species that have been named so far, but there's probably many more that we simply haven't discovered yet. And so we have a biased sample to begin with. And then, of course, in terms of conservation interest, there's always more interest in sort of charismatic megafauna and maybe less interest in some of the more abundant organisms like, insects and mollusks that make up the vast majority of species on Earth. So we don't necessarily have a good understanding of extinction rates across the whole span of life on Earth. And then when we go to the fossil record, of course, we have a biased fossil record. So not everything can be preserved as a fossil. Fossils are more likely to be found in certain environments. So the evidence for mass extinctions, interestingly, actually comes mostly from shallow marine environments. That's because there's lots of fossils that are preserved in shallow marine environments. But we also know that today, some of the species that are the most at risk of extinction and some of the species that have gone extinct already in the last few hundred years tend to be island species, freshwater species. So actually organisms that are living in quite different environments from what we're typically getting in the fossil record. But with all of those caveats and all of that said, and taking into account uncertainty as best as we can, it does appear that extinction rates now are probably at least 1 to 2 orders of magnitude higher than what we call the background extinction rates that we see in the fossil record. So that's definitely something that warrants attention. And I think with that, I'll pass the mic along here.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
Okay, so I was told I could bring some props, so hopefully I can maybe pull a few things out while I'm also holding the microphone. As Kirstin mentioned, I work on lampreys. I think that you did mention that. Everybody knows what a T-Rex is. Not everybody knows what a lamprey is, so I did bring a rubber model of one. So lampreys are ancient jawless vertebrates. They've been around for well over 400 million years. Somewhere in here, I'm not sure if I can find, I've got, T-shirts and bumper stickers that are, respect your elders, 450 million years old, and so on. So the reason why I think I was asked to participate in the panel is because lampreys are often referred to as living fossils, that because they've been around for so long, they've lived through at least 4 of the 5 mass extinction events that Joe referred to. And they're not a very diverse group. There's only about 40 to 50 species worldwide, so they haven't, specialized and diversified, but they've sort of stuck with what they know. They're very persistent in their very generalist behaviors. So if you aren't familiar with lampreys, so I mentioned that it was a jawless vertebrate, so it doesn't have the hinged jaws that all the rest of the vertebrates do. If you're familiar with a lamprey, you're probably familiar with it in the Laurentian Great Lakes, where it's an invasive pest parasitizing the fish in the Great Lakes. It's native to the Atlantic Ocean, where it can get to 1 meter in length. In its native range, it lives sort of in peaceful coexistence with large-bodied prey. Isn't a problem there. But once it was allowed access into the Great Lakes through canals, it became very problematic, killing the smaller-bodied hosts that it's feeding on. It's been a pest since the 1940s, 1950s, when it caused a collapse of the multi-billion-dollar commercial fisheries. And the fact that it costs, tens of millions of dollars every year to control it gives you an idea of how persistent they are. They're quite resistant to control, quite able to persist in the face of adversity. So one of the reasons why I think lampreys have been able to persist when other more specialized lineages have gone extinct is because they are generalists. They don't specialize. So the sea lamprey, for example, has been found feeding on at least 50 different host species, not just bony fishes, but they also sometimes feed on sharks. Even though sharks have a lot of urea in their blood, they're able to deal with that. Marine mammals, basically anything, which makes them not at all dependent on a single host. So there's some species that are specialists feeding on only one host. If that host goes extinct or its abundance declines through overfishing or its distribution changes as a result of climate change, the parasite is also at risk. So lampreys very adaptable in that respect. The other way that they're good generalists, and I think in this way they're, and I'll say it, superior to something like a Pacific salmon. Pacific salmon, as many of you probably know, home to their natal streams. They use olfactory cues to find the stream that they hatched in themselves a couple of years earlier. Lampreys don't do that. Instead, that they cue into pheromones produced by larval lampreys. And so that's a way of determining what's a good stream right now, not a good stream a couple of years ago when you came out of the stream. And so, especially now with a lot of anthropogenic changes, if your natal stream is now a subdivision or it's, access to it has been blocked by a dam, then that homing strategy isn't very good. But lampreys just go with what's currently good. So that's another way that they've been able to be very successful. And then a third way is that they also have the ability to, at least most of the lineages, get rid of the parasitic feeding stage altogether. And so that's let me see if I have the one here. We have 3 lamprey species in Manitoba, fortunately not the invasive sea lamprey. One of the species that we have in Manitoba is the northern brook lamprey. This is an adult in this tube right now. This is as big as it gets, that it has the same filter feeding larval stage that all of the parasitic lampreys do, but after it undergoes metamorphosis, it never feeds again and reproduces at this size. And so it doesn't migrate, it doesn't feed parasitically, and so it's able to then survive in areas that a parasitic lamprey wouldn't be, a parasitic population wouldn't be supported. And there's many populations that can be facultative parasites, switching or not, depending on the circumstances. So there's potentially a lot that we can learn about, extinction risks, the tendency for persistence from these sort of living fossils. Oh, and just because it's fun, I'll just pull out one last thing. This would get some funny looks when I would wear this to Superstore during the early stages of COVID.
Okay, so we've heard from our panel, and it's now time to turn it over to the audience for questions. So if anybody has a question, you can just raise your hand, and the mic will make its way to you.
We don't have a talk today to give away, so you need to start and motivate yourself with a question.
Okay, maybe.
Oh, I didn't see you.
You mentioned polar bears earlier, and you also mentioned more northerly latitudes. I mean, I think it would be safe to say that there are specialist species that are hit twice, one by latitude and two by their specialized needs in terms of how they hunt and their need for ice.
Was the question, are they specialized? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming the risk is because of, one, the northern latitude, and two, the limited the degree to which they're specialized for, their food sources and whatever else.
Yeah, I would think, feeding on only one specialized food source definitely seems like it would imply a greater risk than something like a generalist species that can feed on multiple different things. I guess we know that polar bears are somewhat adaptable, so I've heard stories now that some of the polar bears that are living around Churchill are switching their feeding behavior to feed on belugas by hunting them from rocks along the shoreline. So, there is potentially still some room for behavioral adaptability in species, and that's the sort of thing that's very hard to detect in the fossil record for sure, and even in the modern sometimes.
Yeah, unfortunately, our polar bear expert that was supposed to be on the panel isn't here to give us some more insight into the polar bears. So we'll do our best with what we know about the animals that we're familiar with. So what do you think about lampreys and that type of a question? Like, because they are not specialized, do they? I think, like you mentioned already, they're better at adapting to changing environments.
Yeah, and there's definitely trade-offs that with lampreys being such generalists, they've never been a particularly speciose group. I mean, it's just a couple of dozen species. They aren't going to be diversifying into all sorts of different niches. That they sort of have two ways of making a living, either feeding parasitically on anything out there or not feeding at all. After metamorphosis, they don't sort of radiate out into a bunch of different niches, and so it's sort of that longevity versus diversification.
Okay, testing. Sorry. On a slightly different topic, since we're covering extinction, I had a question about de-extinction. As many animals have been driven to extinction from human actions, is there an argument to be made that we should fight to bring back the animals that we've driven to extinction?
Thank you, Ergon. I think that's a pretty cool question. And so for those who aren't initiated, de-extinction is this idea that, maybe we can bring some animals that are already extinct back from extinction using modern genetic tools. And so, of course, there's lots of ethical concerns around doing this. Should we actually do it? Is it going to be beneficial for the environment if we do that? A lot of the ideas have been circulating around the mammoth, because we have enough DNA information from mammoths that it's at least conceivable that we could try that. And some of the arguments in favor of it would be, the mammoths probably were behaving a lot like other more contemporary large browsing animals and grazing animals, that they're, kind of ecosystem engineers, so they're changing the environment, and they might have been important in altering the Arctic and tundra environments where they were living. So potentially, a similar argument to reintroducing bison into certain areas, would it be worth reintroducing mammoths into areas where they used to survive? Of course, it's a kind of a different question of time scale here, since bison were largely, extirpated from large parts of their range just a couple hundred years ago, whereas, the mammoths have been gone for 10,000-ish years. And so I would say, from my perspective, that perhaps we're better if we're really interested in conservation. Perhaps we're better off spending our money on trying to conserve things that are still with us today. Although I do see the scientific appeal of bringing back a mammoth. It would be pretty cool.
Yeah, and I would sort of agree that it's cool to do, and especially or to contemplate even, in some of those very iconic, charismatic species would sort of get people's attention. Given the number of species that are still with us that are at risk of extinction, I think our efforts are probably better put into protecting them. And then the other concern, of course, is that a lot of species are going extinct because of habitat loss. There's no point in bringing something back if it's going to be kept in a zoo because there's no habitat for it. And so, those charismatic species and the idea of bringing something back from extinction is certainly appealing, but yeah, there's a lot of maybe less charismatic species that are winking out as we speak.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question that I've thought about as well, because the mammoth went extinct for a reason. And it actually, nobody's 100% sure exactly why they went extinct. Was it climate change? Was it because of habitat loss from people? So if we don't even know why they went extinct, why would we want to bring that back into a completely different world? So it's always something I've thought about. I have a follow-up question to that. Like, if, as Joe has said, in the fossil record, we've seen examples over and over and over and over again of things going extinct. So when we're thinking about conservation today, isn't it all eventually going to go extinct? Shouldn't we, how do we balance conservation with preserving an environment that we can still thrive in, and trying to fight off extinction that we know is inevitable? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think this gets back to a point that I started to make during the introduction, which was, talking about the difference between background extinctions and mass extinctions. And so if we want to understand, we're observing some extinctions in contemporary times, but we want to understand what is the significance of those extinctions, because we know that extinction is a natural phenomenon. It's been happening since there's been life on Earth. So how much extinction is abnormal compared to what we know from the fossil record? And so, like I was saying, we do have some evidence, with all of the caveats that come with it, that there are elevated rates of extinction in the last few hundred years or few thousand years compared to what we observe generally in the fossil record. And then if we want to, I guess, think about, then acknowledging those increased numbers of extinctions that appear to be being driven by human causes, should we be conserving those species? And I'm a naturalist at heart, so for me there's an inherent value to all of natural history and an inherent value to trying to preserve diversity. But there's also plenty of other arguments for preserving diversity in terms of the functioning of ecosystems, and maintaining more diversity maintains healthier and more robust ecosystems. So I think there's many reasons why we would want to conserve species, but at the same time, there are so many species that we can potentially be interested in conserving that I am sure that we'll have to make decisions about which ones we're going to try to focus our efforts on. And that's always a tricky topic, because there are different ways that you could try to prioritize one species over another based on its value and its habitat to its food web, for example, or maybe how distinctive it is in terms of its evolutionary history. I'm not sure there's one right answer for that, but maybe we should be considering multiple different factors when we make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And I was sort of thinking with my work on CSIWA, Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, that we often talk about that our role isn't necessarily to conserve, it's not just species that are rare. There are some species that are naturally rare, but it's the ones that are endangered, the ones that are under threat and anthropogenic threat. And I'm trying to think, I've been on the committee since 2007, and I can't think of a single species that we were concerned about, that we weren't concerned about it because it was threatened by human activities. I suspect that, there must be some, when we talk about a background rate of extinction, some that are just maybe naturally on their way out, but the vast majority that we're concerned about are, of course, are concerned because they're threatened by human activity.
Question from the audience.
Yeah, hi. So I had a question about with the land prey. You were talking about how it takes millions of dollars to kind of conserve them and kind of control them in a way. What kind of goes into controlling them?
Yes, it's there's sort of two main control methods that are used. One is fairly straightforward, that because they migrate, that they spend 4 to 7 years as larvae burrowed in the sediment of streams in the Great Lakes, and then after metamorphosis, they migrate down to the lakes, feed parasitically for a year or two, and then they migrate back upstream to spawn. And so a number of barrier dams were put in the 50s and 60s that would block their migration, and with traps to haul out, tens of thousands of them each spring when they migrate. So there's that. And then the other one was very fortuitous, and it was largely based on the fact that lampreys are such an ancient vertebrate, distantly related to anything else, that it was discovered that there was a chemical that would kill lampreys and not anything else. And it was just trial and error. It was years of trial and error with 7 days a week doing these experiments in pickle jars where they would put in 10 rainbow trout in one jar, 10 larval lampreys in another jar, any chemicals they could get a hold of, put them in overnight, and they would come back. And in all the cases, initially, either they were both dead or neither were dead. And then I think it was like chemical number 4,700 and something, they came back in, and the rainbow trout were completely fine and the larval lampreys were dead. We didn't know at that time why it was effective killing lampreys and not anything else. And it's only been discovered since then that it's because lampreys, being a very primitive vertebrate, don't have the enzyme to detoxify that lampricide. And so that lampricide now is used. It's put into the tributary streams where larval lampreys are found, and it kills them before they become parasitic. The downside is that it also kills native lampreys in the Great Lakes. So it's very specific to lampreys, but it's not sea lamprey specific. So part of my research is trying to control the bad lamprey, and the other part of my research is trying to conserve the good lampreys.
We have a question from online.
Yes. This question comes from Andy, one of our online viewers. Have polar bears been around long enough to have experienced climate events in their own past?
So since we don't have our polar bear person here, I think I can say whatever I want on this question. But I did do a little bit of reading before this about polar bears and what we know about their origins. So the oldest fossil polar bears are probably around 120,000 years old, which does take them back to the last interglacial period, which was potentially a little bit warmer than it is presently. So they're the origin of polar bears themselves, it's not quite clear, but some of the estimates have suggested maybe 300,000 to 500,000 years ago. Relatively recent for a species, but again, it's possible that they have actually survived through an interglacial period before. And there's even some possible evidence of hybridization with brown bears, which is also happening today. So that's interesting, and maybe gives some hope for the polar bears, at least in refugia in the far north, even if their population numbers decrease further south.
My question is about whether you can just expand a little more about the fact that if some species have been around longer, they have a higher chance of, persistent to extinction. I think, Margaret, you also touched on how long lampreys have been around.
Margaret, you can answer first, maybe.
Yeah, unless, I don't know, Joe, if you wanted to start about the observation that species that have been around longer tend to have a greater chance of persistence.
So that's something that's been observed from fossil data, but it's not entirely clear why that's the case. I think the general theory, though, is that it's something to do with a priority effect, where species that are already existing in an environment in a large abundance have some kind of ecological priority over a newcomer species, so they can kind of outcompete the newcomers generally, as opposed to newcomers might be occurring in lower abundances. They might be occupying a more restricted geographic range initially, and then they don't manage to survive as long.
Okay, we talked a little bit about the multiple factors for mass extinction. Where are we currently?
So this has been, obviously big in the news. Are we in the sixth mass extinction? And so based on the fossil record, we define mass extinctions based on the percentage of species that have gone extinct, and then also on the rates of extinction. So based on the percentage of species that's gone extinct, we haven't reached mass extinction levels yet, at least not the levels of the big five. Based on the rates of extinction, we could be getting there. And depending on the precise rate of extinction in the modern, which is, again, hard to estimate, but given the range of uncertainties, we might be looking at something like a few hundred to a few thousand years before we see percentages of species lost that are equivalent to the big five mass extinctions. And that's all assuming that, that rate remains constant over that time and doesn't increase or decrease, right?
You might have answered this question already, but if you've got species that have been around forever and you get the newer species coming in, is it safe to assume that one of the reasons they wouldn't last as long is because they're more specialized?
Is it safe to assume? Not necessarily, because there can be various different reasons for extinction. Sometimes it can just be random, and in fact, one of the big ideas that's come out of mass extinctions that often mass extinctions operate under different rules than in a typical evolutionary regime. So if something like an asteroid impacts the Earth, you can imagine that the environment is changing so drastically and in such an unpredictable way that species are not equipped to handle that at all. And so some of the extinctions could be essentially random with respect to traits that otherwise might have impacted their survival. So I think whether specialization or generalization has an impact is going to be a little bit context dependent, both on what's driving the extinction and the particular species that's involved and its network of interactions that it's poised in.
Yeah, and it may be too that, and I don't necessarily know if this applies on an evolutionary timescale or just sort of an ecological timescale, but sometimes the newcomers have an advantage. I mean, that's why invasive species often are so problematic, is if they come into a novel environment without predators and disease and all that, they can actually do quite well. But again, I'm not sure on an evolutionary timescale how that plays out.
Yeah, I think we do see examples of that after mass extinctions. There are these certain taxa, like the recovery taxa, that are they act almost like an invasive species in that they can reproduce very quickly and they can live in a bunch of different types of environments, so they'll take over. Like one example is after the Cretaceous mass extinction, there's a fern spike. So we get lots of ferns that are recovering first in these ecosystems because they can grow much more quickly than other types of plants. So I think it's a similar idea to the invasive species, but that's recolonizing after mass extinction.
We have two questions about lampreys from our online audience. I'll read them both. This first one comes from Sam. What traits made lampreys and hagfish survive to this day, since they are the only extant jawless vertebrates? And this comes from Avery. Do lampreys have a natural predator?
Yeah, so I'll start with the first question. And so in terms of how lampreys have been able to survive for so long, I think that sort of ties into what I was talking about initially about them being very generalists, not specializing, keeping all of their options open despite any sort of major environmental climatic changes. Hagfishes are the other group of extant jawless vertebrates. They have also survived hundreds of millions of years, and I would say that probably they've survived that long for different reasons. They tend to be very deep sea, and so that they've sort of, I would say, probably avoided a lot of the climatic upheaval that you would see in marine coastal areas. So that we see both of them surviving perhaps for different reasons. Then the second question from Avery, I can't remember what it was.
Do lampreys have any natural predators?
They do, and this is part of the problem too, I think, in the Great Lakes, that larval lampreys. So lampreys, when they spawn in streams, when the eggs are in the nests, they're more prone to predation. But once they hatch and burrow into the sediment, they're pretty protected from predation. There's only a few species that can really root them out of the sediment, including sturgeons and eels, and so in the Great Lakes, sea lamprey got in at the same time that lake sturgeon populations and American eel populations plummeted, and so that they didn't have the natural predators. There are other times of the life cycle where they're also vulnerable to predation. That protected larval stage is quite resistant to, the mortality rates are quite low. The other times where they're prone to predation is during their downstream migrations or their upstream migrations, when they're sort of concentrated in the streams.
There you go. Otherwise, I have to ask a question about microbes, right?
Hi. I have a question about mass extinctions. In many cases, on these events that happened in the past, we see that there's these kind of external factors driving, like you mentioned, climate change. But sometimes also it seems that the populations itself are already changing at a brink of something happening, that these external events just push them over. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. That sort of gets back into what I was talking about with this hypothesis of the press and pulse impacts of mass extinctions. So, a lot of times it looks like there are certain slower acting stressors that are acting for a longer period of time, and then you have some kind of a pulse that eventually pushes things over the edge. So I think there's been some idea with dinosaurs that their numbers were declining a little bit towards the end of the Cretaceous already, before the asteroid impacted, and then you have an asteroid impact. You also actually have some volcanic eruptions of very large scale that are going on at essentially the same time. So those are changing the atmospheric chemistry, and so multiple different factors interacting. I guess, what's potentially interesting about what's going on today is that it seems to be more biotically driven than a lot of past mass extinctions tend to be. We tend to be associating past mass extinctions more with abiotic drivers, like something to do with the environment at a large scale is changing. That I suppose could in some respects be just due to a lack of evidence for the sort of biotic factors that might also have been having an impact at the same time. And so like you were saying, maybe we have some sort of weedy invasive taxa that are coming in after the late Cretaceous, but maybe the success of those organisms was actually pushing some surviving organisms over the brink as well. Who knows?
Okay, I'm going to ask a question and then, okay. So because now I started it again. So you would mention that there's a background level of extinction that's going on all the time, underlying the human indicated kind of extinction processes, right? So which means, that's a natural process we have nothing to do about. What do you think about conserving and how to conserve those species? And what I'm aiming at is how do you conserve a species that's going extinct? You cannot do this except for you storing the data, for instance, of that species, which would be DNA, for instance, right? How is your feel about this? And, should we do more of cataloging, and how is that tied into the de-extinction question moving forward?
Yeah, I like that question as a museum person, because, we're very concerned at museums in terms of cataloging biodiversity, right? And so, of course, as species start to become rarer, and if species go extinct, at the very least, we can have a catalog of what was here so that people can learn about it. And potentially, if we did want to look at de-extinction of more recently extinct organisms, or even organisms that are still extant but have such small population sizes that it might not be feasible for them to survive without some intervention, museums could potentially play an interesting role there. And maybe, given enough time, some habitat regeneration can happen to the extent that we might be able to reintroduce something that's no longer with us. I think it's an interesting idea. It's one that's definitely worth considering. And at the very least, we should know what we have and what we might lose. So keeping collections is very important, I think.
And along with that, there's also new species being discovered all the time as well that we just didn't know. And it goes along with that cataloging. This organism of some kind might have been around for millions of years, but we just didn't discover it yet. So along with we're discovering species that are going extinct, we're also discovering new species on the planet as well.
And it's interesting actually because when we're thinking about background extinction levels, and I was mentioning earlier that speciation or species origin events are often somewhat correlated with extinction rates in the fossil record. And there's very little information about speciation rates nowadays. And most of the papers that I've seen either say, oh, it's happening so slowly that it's not really very important in contemporary timescales, which to me seems like a little bit of a silly argument, because we now know that drastic genetic and morphological changes can happen quite rapidly, much more so than we thought some decades ago. And then I guess the other argument essentially says that, oh yeah, it's probably about the same as the background rate of extinction, but I haven't really seen a lot of good quantitative evidence as to whether that's actually the case or not. So that would be pretty interesting. We might expect that to be the case, but is it actually? And there's some interesting ideas that I read then about, potentially could invasive species actually then speciate because they've now been introduced to a new environment. They're interacting with new organisms, and they're potentially reproductively isolated from the ancestral population. So how long would it actually take for that to happen?
You discussed the fact that in most of the cases that you studied, that human factors have led to the extinction. And I'm wondering what kind of information you have about processes that might interfere with the process of extinction once it's visible that it's being threatened. How can we interrupt it? Are there any examples where it has been successfully arrested? Or is it a fait accompli once you recognize the process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think in a lot of cases, at least the ones that I'm thinking of, that it may be species that are endangered because of human causes and so on. And I'm also thinking sort of like in terms of, background rates of extinction, if there's some species that are just going to go extinct regardless of our interventions. Like if a species is listed on the Species at Risk Act, there's a recovery plan. The recovery plan is intended to remove those, human-made threats. We can't recover a species if there's nothing that we can do to save it, if it's just sort of on its way out anyways. And then in terms of reversing, the most dramatic cases I can think of are either with some species that maybe were severely over-harvested and then harvest has ceased. In some cases, there has been captive rearing to help supplement the wild populations. In some cases where a species is severely endangered because the population has declined so much that inbreeding has become such a problem that, again, there has been human intervention to help increase the genetic diversity by sort of planned crossbreeding. I work mostly on freshwater fishes, and that there are few of those heroic actions done for a lot of freshwater fish species, but I'm thinking of some of the large mammals where those sorts of interventions have been fairly successful at bringing a species sort of back from the brink. I can't think of any yet that are completely self-sufficient now, that they still need that sort of ongoing human help, but there is some hope in some of those cases.
Thank you.
would be fun.
Sorry. Go for it. Hi, this is a question related to conservation purposes. So we talked about that we're in a current state where we want to make the best to avoid extinction patterns that have been seen in the past. So as of right now, do you think both that the conservation efforts are more put in towards vertebrate animals as of comparing to invertebrate animals, or do you think there's any balance to the conservation efforts?
I think it's reasonably balanced. I'm optimistic to see, at least from the sort of the government resources devoted to conservation efforts. So on Kasiwik, I'm on the freshwater fishes subcommittee. There's definitely terrestrial mammals, marine fishes, birds that do get a lot of attention, but there's also an arthropods and vascular plants and mosses and lichens that all of the taxonomic groups do seem to get equal, sort of an equal share of the pie when it comes to assessing species and listing species. And in some respects, some of the vertebrate species can be harder to conserve. They might get assessed, but then because if they have commercial value, it's sometimes harder to put restrictions on their harvest, and so it can be sort of a two-edged sword that people are interested, but it's also harder then to cease the harvest.
I have a follow-up. If in terms of conservation, if we're just focusing on maintaining pristine habitat, just leaving area where people don't go, and then is that really biasing whether we're trying to conserve a specific plant or a specific animal if we're just leaving entire habitats untouched?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it makes me think of sort of where we are maybe trying to go with conservation. Right now, conservation is largely still on a species by species basis, but the sort of ultimate goal is to maybe do it more on an ecosystem basis and identifying, and I'm sure many of you have heard of talking about, conservation hotspots. If there's, one area that has, one species in an equal-sized area that has 115 species, it makes more sense to conserve that hotspot with the multiple species. And yeah, there's definitely some, even within Canada, some hotspots, at least in terms of freshwater organisms, fish, mussels, that tend to have a real treasure trove of species. Unfortunately, a lot of them are in southwestern Ontario that are also very, very heavily hit by a lot of anthropogenic threats. But yeah, that the idea would be then to try to do a ecosystem level approach.
Hi. I have a lamprey themed question. So you mentioned that lampreys are more generalistic, especially the parasitic ones. So when you look, I do the fossil record a bit more like fish from the fish fossil record, and when we talk about more generalistic fish, they tend to be very opportunistic, right? Looking at anything they can grab, including juvenile forms. Would you kind of see the reverse behavior in lampreys, where you would see the parasitic larvae feeding on the adult forms much?
Yeah, the larvae themselves actually aren't parasitic. That they're filter feeders in streams, in which is another I think advantageous strategy. That when lampreys first colonized fresh water, there wasn't much living in fresh water, so it was sort of a safe haven for the larvae to develop in. They feed on largely detritus, which is very energy poor, so it takes them years to even get this big, and then they undergo that metamorphosis, move out of the stream, and then take advantage of the rich resources in the sea to feed parasitically. So you have that division of sort of different habitats, different food sources, so you wouldn't have one life stage feeding on the other.
Well, I can ask a question, and then I'm running out of questions. So I have to ask a microbiome question, so which I was promising anyway. So we know a lot about dinosaurs. I can just say that again because they are like so visible, right? But we also have like a lot of microbes that actually make up the microbiome on which those larger animals feed. And I don't know if you have enough understanding about extinction and processes of extinction that were triggered by these, and you were mentioning like biological catastrophes that lead to the extinction of the ones that we can track. Is there an understanding of what happened there? And is there maybe an opportunity to go like looking at like later records of like ice cores to see which organism lived at a certain point in time, and maybe use that information to create some resilience of a biological change that occurs today? And I don't know. So, I mean, is there any indication about the role that microbes have played basically in the extinctions, and how can we use that for like getting a resilience for the current extinction state? I guess is my question.
So from a fossil record perspective, that is a really difficult question to answer. When I talk about the big 5 mass extinctions, these are based on fossil evidence from large animal fossils, largely. We have some plant fossils as well, of course, but large organisms are making up the majority of that easily visible fossil record where we can recognize distinct species and track them through time. When it comes to microbes, we know that before about 500, 600 million years ago, pretty much all life was very small, mostly single-celled. And we do have fossil evidence of it, but it's very sparse, very scattered. There's probably good reason to think that there would have been mass extinctions prior to the origin of large organisms, because we had really dramatic environmental changes during some of those periods. But we don't really have direct evidence for those. They're more inferred. And then it's interesting, you bring up like microbiome diversity. Again, something that we have basically no evidence for in the fossil record as far as I'm aware. Maybe there's there's probably something in some more recent records, like, mummified organisms from the past few 100,000 years. Maybe there's some chemical evidence that we could rally to look at that, but I don't think that a whole lot of that has been done. But we know that, lots of microbial organisms are host specific today, so there's no reason to think they wouldn't have been in the past. And when their specific hosts went extinct, then they would have as well. So probably the mass extinctions of animals would have corresponded with mass extinctions of microbes too, or vice versa.
I mean, you could look, for instance, in an amber kind of preserved kind of organism, you could actually extract DNA and look at the DNA sequences that are in the gut, for instance, right?
So with amber, it's tricky because the DNA molecules themselves are not too stable, right? So we can extract DNA from things up to a certain age. I can't remember the age offhand now, you might recall. But after a certain point in time, it's basically too old for the DNA to have survived in any form that we can still interpret. So we might still have the individual bases from the DNA left over, but it's essentially fallen apart in such a way that we can't read it anymore. So it's not like you could just extract DNA from microbes from the age of dinosaurs, but for the same reason that Jurassic Park doesn't work.
Okay. If you don't want more microbiome questions, you actually have to ask a different one. Sorry.
I would have been interested to know about the future for the polar bears with climate change, but can you tell us anything about the future prognosis of the coral reefs as they respond to severe climate changes that seems to be progressing?
Would you like to answer?
Yeah, actually, I don't know a lot about that. My undergraduate degree decades ago was in marine biology, but I've gotten very, very out of date in terms of a lot of stuff. Yeah, that's definitely a concern. I'm trying to remember a talk I had seen a couple of years ago, and I can't remember now what some of the. I can't remember now whether it was some sort of gene editing that was being explored as a way to try to sort of hasten adaptation of corals to sort of combat some of the bleaching that we're seeing. I've forgotten any of those sorts of details, but it's definitely a real concern. Yeah. Yeah, and again, I guess it's kind of like with some of the concerns about polar bears and other things, whether or not the changes that we're seeing are just too rapid for evolution to keep up with, and whether whether humans can help or not.
I guess from a fossil record perspective, we know that corals don't like warm temperatures, but especially corals don't like acidic oceans. And so at times in the past when we've had warmer temperatures, but especially more acidic oceans, the corals generally kind of decrease in diversity. At some points in time, when we have very warm climates, like in the Cretaceous period, we actually have different groups of organisms that take over as the reef builders. So we actually had bivalves, like clams, that were forming reefs in the Cretaceous period more so than corals. Of course, that happens on very long time scales. The corals can potentially survive in refugia and rebound, I suppose, but
Yeah, like this is actually an assignment my students had to do in their paleontology course just this past couple of weeks, is that there have been reef structures of some kind since the Paleozoic, so after the Cambrian. I mean, in the Cambrian, these reefs were formed of sponges, mostly, and then into the Ordovician throughout the Paleozoic, big sponge reefs, and then there were little bits of coral in there, and then the corals took over, and then the sponges took over, and then the bivalves took over, and then the corals took over, and then the reefs right now are mostly coral reefs. So if something did happen to the corals, it's quite likely that some other reef-building organism, maybe the sponges, would take over again, and we'd have sponge-dominated reefs into the future with a warming ocean.
Is there anything that we can learn today from species like lampreys to help endangered species like polar bears survive into the future?
That's a really good question, because it's one thing to make an observation and to sort of, after the fact, explain what might be allowing lampreys to persist for so long. Yeah, using that, I'm not sure how we would use that information. I mean, like if we say lampreys persisted because they're generalists, you can't overnight make something like a polar bear a generalist, although you've indicated that they may be doing that to an extent on their own, maybe with being forced to adapt, but there may be more of that than we recognize.
I guess the general lessons would be that if extinction events are often multiple stressor kind of situations, then if there's some stressors that we can impact more than others, then maybe concentrating on impacting those stressors gives us a chance to save species that might otherwise not be able to persist, given that full range of different stressors.
Yeah, I think the rate of the stressor was brought up a few times. Like if it's a very slow environmental change, then those animals will be able to keep up. So like with sea ice melting, if it's melting slowly, then the polar bears might be able to find other sources of food before. But if the environment changed overnight, they wouldn't have time to adapt to that new environment. And we see that over and over again in the fossil record as well, the species that are adapting more quickly to their environment, or if especially for a mass extinction, they're the ones that are likely to survive.
Yeah, and in general, species that have short generation times and a large number of offspring at a time tend to be able to evolve more rapidly. So large-bodied mammals that have small litters, long generation times are definitely sort of behind the 8 ball in that respect.
Okay.
Yes. Always the furthest away. No, that's good.
So another question about lampreys, but about the conservation part. And actually, it's more about the lamprey's natural predators, because you've mentioned that they decreased a lot in population size, right? So what kind of efforts are being made or could be made in the future to try and help these populations going back up?
Yeah, so maybe this could be indeed a sort of a win-win situation. So both the lake sturgeon and the American eel are both subjects of conservation concerns. So there's a lot of efforts to restore both of those populations in the Great Lakes and elsewhere. And so, I mean, one of the main initial causes of lake sturgeon declines was overharvest. That's largely stopped, but again, they're large-bodied, late maturing species, so it'll take a while for their populations to recover. And the main threat to them now is habitat loss, habitat fragmentation. So a lot of work is being done on that. Gary Anderson at our university here, he's doing a lot of work with hatchery supplementation of lake sturgeon. So that's a good thing. And then with American eel, one of the main causes of its decline was barriers to migration. And there's a lot of work now to try to restore the connectivity as they're migrating out to the ocean to spawn and coming back in. There's still, I mean, you might be familiar with fish ladders that allow jumping fish like salmon to be able to get past barriers. Eels don't use fish ladders, but there are sort of most of the efforts right now are collecting them in buckets or tanks below a dam and transporting them above. That's at least something. So I would hope that within the next decade or two, we'll see much healthier lake sturgeon and American eel populations in the Great Lakes.
So follow up on that. You said eels and lake sturgeon feed on early life or the early life cycles of lampreys. What about when they're adults? Do lampreys go after sturgeon and eels?
Definitely sturgeon. I'm not so sure of eels. I'll have to look that up because I said there's at least 50 species that have been found to be a prey for sea lamprey. I don't remember eel being on that list, but definitely lampreys like sturgeon. Yeah.
Another microbiome question. So I can have one, buys you time. What about, do you see a role of genetically engineering techniques like CRISPR in adjusting the survivability or like the fitness of a species that you see to actually accommodate, let's say, climate change or any stresses that they have in their habitat to come, to prevent extinction? Or is there an impact on, is that then still the same species? Or I don't know, so maybe you thought about this.
Yeah, there's actually some work starting to explore that. I'm more aware of the use of CRISPR and gene editing to try to control invasive species, but it's sort of two sides of the same coin. I know that some people are exploring that for conservation. Two examples that, not necessarily specific examples, but there's a lot of work that's looking at sex ratio manipulation. This is largely from a control point of view, that if you can create all male populations, essentially breed females out of existence, that would be a great control strategy. And then that could also be done to sort of restore species of conservation concern by restoring more equal or female biased populations. And then I think some of the other work that's exploring gene editing for conservation might be to hasten some of that adaptation that we've been talking about that maybe is too slow if left to its own devices, trying to speed up some of the adaptation to thermal stress and those sorts of things. But again, I'm more aware of using that for control than conservation, but I know there is work being done on it.
It shouldn't go too far, right?
I swear it's the last one. I'm just following up on what you were saying about the eel, trying to facilitate migration of the eels. Would that affect in any way or just offer new opportunities for these parasitic lampreys to then get into new habitats?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because it sort of ties back in with what I was saying about one of the earliest control methods was putting up barrier dams that prevented sea lamprey from migrating into the streams. That's definitely not selective, that it also blocks the migration of a lot of other fish. There's some work to make it more selective, that lampreys aren't quite as good of swimmers as others, and so if you sort of modify the barrier, some fish might get past and others might not. But this is definitely that good news, bad news scenario, that as you restore connectivity for native fishes, it also allows for invasive species to spread, not just sea lamprey, but round goby and all, I think we're up to more than 200 invasive species in the Great Lakes now. Manitoba is much more pristine in comparison in terms of we still have only a handful of invasive species. And so a lot of those dams in the Great Lakes that have been bad for some of the native species, they are at least keeping some of those invasive species from spreading. So yeah, it'll definitely be a balancing act to try to allow American eel back into all of its sort of native tributaries without allowing everything else in.
This question comes from Bob online. If generalists survived the longest, and humans being the ultimate generalists, having adapted and dominated all earthly environments, does that imply humans stand a good chance of surviving the longest of all the species?
So this is a very interesting question. And this is a question I often throw back to my students and say, are humans still evolving? And is it more of a technological evolution now that humans are using? Basically, we're using technology to try to stop climate change, to try to maintain our ecosystems and our environment so that we can keep surviving. So I would say it is more, we are leaning much more on technology now to, I don't know if we're still evolving. It's a good food for thought.
Yeah, and I think, I'm just trying to remember some of the things that I read. I largely focus on fish, but like with human evolution, if I'm remembering correctly, that we have humans, we're losing our wisdom teeth, for example. That's sort of an actual morphological evolution that I think we have smaller jaws and don't bigger brains, and so that there seems to be, even over recorded historical time, we're starting to see some of those changes. And I'm not sure, big thumbs for for technology.
I guess we're also in a very interesting environment right now where, global travel has never been easier than the past century. Before that, it was very difficult or, not even possible at all between many parts of the world. So there's more, I guess, intermixing of different populations of humans now than there ever was, which is always interesting from an evolutionary perspective, because every time you get isolation of populations, you have potential for divergence, whereas when you bring populations back together, there tends to be more intermingling, higher total genetic diversity. And so I could imagine that potentially slowing down our evolution, at least in the short term, but then you have to trade that off against other factors like the technological factors that are changing so rapidly, and our lifestyles are changing rapidly.
Yeah, but then like you said, with the mixture of populations, you're getting more genetic mixing, and that tends to lead to evolution of new species as well. So
it's kind of a trade-off. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Another question. What do you think were the main environmental factors that might have contributed to the Cambrian explosion? What is the paleontological evidence for that?
Nice. That's a good way to finish for me. So the Cambrian explosion is something that I've thought quite a lot about. There's a lot of different hypotheses for why it might have happened, because it's a very striking pattern in the history of biodiversity on our planet, where we have this relatively sudden emergence of major animal body plans. And what's also interesting, I think, is that after the Cambrian, we haven't seen as dramatic of morphological evolution or evolution in the form of organisms as we saw during that, maybe 30 million year window at the beginning of the Cambrian. So something interesting was going on then. It's probably, like many other things, a combination of different factors. So you have environmental changes that are happening at that time, like increases in oxygenation of the oceans. So the early oceans on Earth were actually poorly oxygenated, especially at depth. And it's only into the Cambrian and some of the later periods where you start to get more mixing of oxygen into the ocean because there's more oxygen in the atmospheres as well. And animals themselves, when they evolved, actually started to burrow into the sediment and then drive oxygen down into the sediment. So the animals are engineering their own environment. That's probably opening up new niches, new ecological opportunities for more animals to evolve into. So I think ecology and the interrelationships between the animals as they were evolving is probably a huge factor. And then there are some really interesting ideas about how the flexibility of evolution itself might have actually varied over long periods of time. So contrary to our sort of uniformitarian idea that evolution has been proceeding essentially at the same pace throughout its entire history, there's some hypotheses and some potential evidence to suggest that the developmental systems of early animals might have been a little bit more flexible after they first evolved, and that basically stability of development has been selectively favored over time, so that that variability in those early developmental systems was dampened down. It probably improved the survivability of the species themselves, but it may have also decreased their capacity to evolve into radically different forms. And I think that's a really cool idea, but one that's quantitatively very difficult to test.
So I think we are under time. So you want to do some closing remarks, Kate?
So thank you, everyone, for engaging with us tonight. I hope you learned something and have some stuff to think about on your way home this evening. And thank you all very much for coming, and have a great night.